Welcome to The Strategic Leader, the podcast for people-focused leaders who want to think, act, and feel more strategic. Welcome back to The Strategic Leader with me, Gemma Bullivant.
And with me, Fee Craig.
And we are going to be spending today continuing our deep dive into the exec teams or senior teams. Tales from the Top Table is the theme of this particular series of The Strategic Leader. And what we're looking to do here is uncover some of the secrets of what that role actually entails. What does it mean to be strategic at that top table? And in the first episode, we introduced this idea of there being three hats to wear. Fee, do you want to remind us what those three hats were?
I will remind us, yes. So we've kind of got three different hats and we need to be aware of which one we're bringing at any given time, maybe all of them. So the first hat is the idea that we are a functional expert in our own area. This is the area that we are probably head of. We might be a director of it. We might be a CE of it. But this is where our core work is, where our core time is spent, where possibly even a big chunk of our career is spent. So I might be an operations expert. I might be a marketing expert. I might be an HR expert. That's your functional expert hat. Second one is your hat as an enterprise leader. Your role on this top team is either running the business or running this part of a business. And that takes you into a much broader capacity around the kinds of conversations you need to be having and the kinds of thinking that needs to happen. But then the third hat is sometimes a hat that we don't even think about, and that's what we're really talking about today, which is how you show up in a team. It's a behavioural hat, and it's linked to kind of your role on the team, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Everybody has a different role to play on the team. We need most of those roles. It can be quite hard to work with some of those different roles. So that's the topic of where we are today.
And as we get further into the series, we're going to be inviting guests to tell us a little bit about their own experiences. So the guests will all have had or currently have senior roles in organisations and have their own unique take on what it's been like for them, their strategic input, how they've felt strategic or not, how they've learned along the way. And where possible, we'll also be putting this lens of individual style or behavioural role, as you mentioned. So let's use this episode as an opportunity to explore that behavioural aspect of being a senior leader on a senior executive team. So why is it even important for us to consider this behavioural role? What's your take on that, Fee?
Well, I mean, this is my core area of fascination and expertise as a behavioural change and team coach. I'm fascinated in the way that teams behave. So it doesn't matter the nature of your business, the industry you're in, and it doesn't matter what your particular job title is. When human beings congregate in a team, we behave in certain ways, and some of those behaviours are really helpful, and some of those behaviours are really unhelpful. And I'm sure even as I'm saying these words, you are kind of nodding and going, yes, I can see that. So as we're talking about this today, it'd be really interesting for you to think, what am I seeing in my team, helpful and hindering? What do I remember from previous teams? Because hopefully there'll be quite a lot of head nodding. This is kind of human level behavior. It's nothing to do with job title. But as human beings, we tend to naturally gravitate to and prefer people who think and behave like us. We feel comfortable, we feel at ease, we feel conversations come more easily. There's lots of nodding. And that can feel a very nice, comfortable space with people that I identify with. But that's not always a good thing in a leadership team or a team that's leading any team that has to solve complex problems. Because when we have complex problems to deal with, which most leadership teams do, we can't all think too similarly or we're going to miss things. So we need to tap into a broad range of thinking styles, behavioral approaches. You can think of it in terms of cognitive diversity, if that helps. We just need to broaden out our approaches and our skill set and our ways of tackling a problem. So that means we need to be alert to behavioral differences, and we need to value behavioral differences. As it's all very well saying, yes, I really value the fact that we all bring different things to the table, but it can be really hard to work with. So, Jem, you're sitting there grinning and nodding. I've got, let me share an example, which actually makes me feel embarrassed quite as I think back to it. But you may have something really similar. I remember a senior leadership team I was on about, a few years back. There was a guy on this team, let's call him Dave. That's not his name, but let's call him that. And he and I were really different behaviourally. We had very different roles on this team. Forget job titles. My role was to throw ideas onto the table. I was always coming up with new ideas. I was chucking them onto the table. Now, I knew some of those ideas were a bit rubbish, but nevertheless, they were going to come and they were going to go on the table. His role, and I now know we'll talk through a Belbin lens shortly. We'll introduce the idea of Belbin team roles. His was what we might call a specialist completer finisher. We'll talk about that in a second. His role was to bring detail, bring expertise, bring very narrow depth. So everything I was saying, he was picking holes in, he was minutely inspecting, he was kind of picking apart and kind of going, well, how are we going to implement that in this particular way? And that behavioral difference used to frustrate me. Almost literally, I wanted to scream and cry. I was literally sitting on my hands in some of those meetings. I now know, I didn't know at the time, I now know that we had some very different behavioral clusters at work. Both of those were needed in the team, but we didn't know that. I didn't value his contribution. He didn't value mine. We just wound each other up. And we also didn't know that if we had other team roles around the table, we could have made really good use of that difference. But we didn't have that, and we didn't know we didn't have it. So we were kind of stuck with just pissing each other off, basically. That probably isn't unusual. Do you have a similar kind of slightly embarrassing remembrance?
Oh, yes. I mean, it's interesting actually that you talk about the chucking ideas onto a table, because I've been in senior. I'm thinking of a particular senior team that I was in, where we probably lacked the ideas person. We found it difficult as a team to generate ideas. It was
Yeah.
a very practical, logical, empathetic team, very caring, very thoughtful, very considered. And sometimes it was really hard to generate new ideas, generate new thinking. And as you're talking about describing your approach in that particular situation, we would have absolutely welcomed you with open arms to chuck those ideas on the table.
If only I'd known. If only I'd known.
So I suppose as you're describing that situation, it's pointing me in my thinking towards occasions where I've noticed a gap of that
Yes.
kind as
Yes.
well.
So it's interesting that you say you noticed a gap, because I think one of the things we have to start with is the notion that we come at life through our own lens. We've talked about this many times on the podcast. And having some kind of model or framework to understand what the possible range of lenses could be can be really useful. I
Mm.
mentioned Belbin team roles just a few minutes ago, and I rate that one, and we'll talk about it a lot in this session because it's something that I use a lot. But that's not the only way of looking at this kind of thing. I know, Jem, you use core strength, SDI core strengths quite a lot in your work.
Yes, I use core strengths, SDIs, which stands for Strengths Deployment Inventory. It's gone through a few iterations over the years, but it still sticks for me as a really strong way of identifying your default lens, and that's a
Yes.
good way of
Yeah.
describing it. So it's not really about skills, it's not really about preferences. It's about what happens when you're on autopilot.
Yeah.
It's about what happens when you don't recognize, for example, when I'm reminded of that team that I just mentioned where we were lacking in ideas people, sometimes you notice that and you dial it up for yourself, or you try to put that hat on for yourself
Yeah.
to fill that gap in the team.
Yeah.
And it may or may not move things forward, and probably wouldn't be nearly as great as if there was someone genuinely playing, to their strengths in that role. But when you're on autopilot, you don't even think about doing that. Whereas when you are more intentional, you may be better able to step away from your default lens and adopt one or two of the other missing roles that might exist in the team.
I think that's really important, that idea about being aware of your default lens and then also being aware of what is needed within a team
Mm,
context. And the
mm.
idea that, you recognize that you needed an ideas person and you didn't really have one. I didn't recognize that what we needed was kind of a moderator in that, almost like a referee in that example, to say, Fee, you've put 10 ideas on the table. 7 of those ideas are really quite shit, but 3 are worth looking at. Dave, I would like you to bring your forensic, detailed, specific lens onto these 3 ideas. And Fee, you can stop talking now. That would have been a really useful thing, but we didn't have that role in the team, didn't even know it existed.
Oh, I think I'd have been that referee.
Oh, yes. Okay. So you can recognize yourself as as I'm describing that kind of
Yeah.
type of behaviors. So let me introduce Belbin team roles. This is it's a profiling tool. As we said, it's not the only one. It's one I use, which is why I'll talk about it here, but it's not the be all and end all. However, they talk about team roles. What's a team role in Belbin context? It's a cluster of behaviors. And we all display there in Belbin terms, there are 9, and we will all display some of those. Very few of us will display all of them. We'll probably be really strong, really naturally strong, like our default, when we're not thinking about it, our default way of showing up will be really strong in 2 or 3 of these ways. And we'll
Okay.
probably be completely missing on a couple of the other ones. That's fine. The point is, as a team, as a group of people, do we have all 9 of these behavioral clusters? Because if we do, then we have everything a team needs to do a really good job and deal with very complex tasks. Most teams have got a couple missing. Most teams will over-index in some. If you have a couple missing, you don't generally recruit an extra person. I mean, mostly that's just not possible. But you said something really interesting a few minutes ago about, I recognized that kind of behavior was missing and I sort of stepped into that role. If we've got an understanding that there are these roles and
Mm.
they're going to be missing, then some people will be able to step in and fill that gap. They'll be able to kind of ramp up something that might be sort of mid-range for them. Or there might be somebody else outside the team that you could bring in on certain occasions because they're really good at X. But you kind of need to have that awareness of what's needed and why all of those behavioral traits are valuable. And certainly I didn't realize how valuable Dave's contribution was because I didn't have a framework to put in. So let's have a look at Belbin. I will rattle through the 9 roles, but as I'm doing this, I think maybe, Jem, a challenge for you, but also mostly for listeners, thinking about what is the sort of default role that I bring to the exec table. So what are yours going to be? Where do you see yourself? Like I say, probably 2 or 3. Can you recognize some of your teammates in some of these descriptions? Do you think you've got all of these roles in your team? And are there some gaps? Or do you think maybe you've got too much of something? Because that can be just as problematic as having a gap. So are you up for that, Jem? Shall I read them out and then you can
Absolutely.
tell me
Yep.
where you think you might sit? So this is literally rattling through a very, very short list. The actual profiling tool is far more in depth. But let's just go, these are types you might be able to recognize yourself. So number 1, in no particular order, plant, somebody who generates ideas and new ways of seeing the problem. This was me throwing ideas on the table. Resource investigator is somebody who brings lots of energy. They like going outside the business, tapping into networks and bringing external perspective and ideas from outside. They bring them into the business. We have number 3, coordinator. This person is really great at clarifying the purpose, helping people play to their strengths, working out who's going to be brought in when, literally coordinating. Shaper is someone who drives the pace, the challenge, the momentum. Sometimes this kind of role can be described as a driver. They sort of, come on, let's get this shit done kind of vibe. We have a monitor evaluator. This was the role that was missing between me and Dave. bringing logic, balance, thoughtful judgment, analysis, maybe a bit dry, but we need them to work out what is worth pursuing and what is not worth pursuing. A team worker, sounds like that team you were describing, Jem, had lots of team workers in it. They're good at building trust, connection, cohesion, harmony. They look out for people, make sure everyone's okay. An implementer is someone who is great at turning decisions into practical action. They are somebody who gets stuff done. They turn the handle. They're just great at churning out the work. We've got completer finisher, someone who is very detailed, loves to look at things forensically. They ensure high quality, follow through, something's finished really, really well. And then we have a specialist, somebody who's got a deep, deep level of expertise in something that's probably quite narrow, but they're real deep experts and professionally protect the kind of professionalism. Again, that's kind of quality control kind of role. There's 9 there. Most teams, especially leadership teams, need all 9 of those roles somewhere in the mix. Don't need 9 people, or however many of you there are, will have covered all of those roles. So, Jem, let me ask you, where do you think you're showing up in that team?
Well, it's interesting because I was thinking that coordinator that really clarifies purpose and helps people play to their strengths, that one
Yes.
resonated for me. Shaper speaks to my strong action driver and
Yeah.
pace. So it's not so much about directive behavior, but certainly trying to keep momentum and keep things ticking along. That one spoke to me. And you mentioned monitor, evaluator, the one that brings that logic, balance, thoughtful judgment might have been the referee. So perhaps that's there more than I thought when you were
Yeah.
describing it. They were the main ones for
Mhm.
me, I think. Shaper,
I can see all of those qualities in you.
yeah.
And I think really important about this, which is, I think, where the real value in this kind of thing. I am more of a plant and a resource investigator, right? So I've got different strengths to you. But I recognize now that I work much better with implementers, monitor evaluators, and shapers. Because without them, I've got too many ideas and not enough action.
Mm.
So kind of the opposite of that team you were describing, who had lots of ability to act and get stuff done, but not necessarily the ideas coming in at the top of the funnel.
Mm. And something that you said earlier about people that maybe have a little bit of mid-range in
Yeah.
some of these,
Yeah.
where you can perhaps dial some of these up. There's 1 or 2 where I feel like I absolutely could dial up. I could absolutely dial up completer finisher
Hmm.
because that that it isn't the role that I love to play,
Hmm.
but it's really important to me that things get finished. So I would dial that up, and that was certainly one that I can also think of that's come up in it's actually a different team to the one that didn't generate the ideas, where I would be the one that basically played that role
Yeah.
to make sure that we weren't leaving all these ideas pinging around and not actually seeing anything through before the
Yeah.
next shiny thing lands.
So you see, that's a really interesting one because that's one I couldn't dial up. I can dial up monitor evaluator. I can dial up team worker. I can't dial up completer finisher. I literally have none. But I recognize, now that I'm familiar with all this, I'm like, I really recognize the value of a completer finisher on a team because they are the ones that assure the quality and ensure the kind of final impact. I mean, in a way, they'd be the one that would send the invoice at the end of a big project. So, like, where would I be if I couldn't send an invoice at the end of a project? It's absolutely critical, but it's a bit of sort of, it's the kind of thing that I would just not get around to doing. And so, though it feels like, oh, it's difficult for me to do that, I really, really value somebody who can do that and look at it like that. So that's really where we want to get to as a team, is to see, I see that people behave very differently from me in certain in certain respects, it can be really easy to be irritated by that and to kind of be at loggerheads with each other and think, I just you don't see it like you don't see it like I do. But actually, we really should value that somebody else is looking at it from a different perspective, because we need all of these things. And if we've got a team understanding that between us, we've either got people who are very strong in these 9 kind of characteristics, or, as you say, we can kind of stretch 1 or 2 of them where we recognize that they're needed. We can kind of, okay, I'm going to put my team worker hat on here. I'm going to forget my plant stuff for the moment. We've already got enough ideas, or there's loads of other people in the team who can do that. I'm going to step into team worker and make sure we're working well together, make sure everyone's involved, make sure people are playing to their strengths. I can step into a slightly different role. But that's really hard to do if we don't have any understanding of a framework of all those different things that are needed. It
Yeah.
can be easy to be irritated by people who behave differently and whose focus is different.
So building that understanding and awareness are the first steps, and
Mhm.
that I understand that. Then recognizing the gaps and what you might need to do with that, which could be addressed perhaps with somebody in the team, yourself or other people in the team, dialing up if they can,
Yeah.
that aspect to fill that gap, and being really honest about the areas that they do feel can be dialed up.
Yeah.
It's interesting what you said. You just don't feel you would be able to dial up complete a finisher, whereas I could.
Yeah.
And there's probably other roles on there that similarly I wouldn't feel I could effectively dial up on
Mhm.
in quite the same way as others. What other strategies might there be if this dialing up and down doesn't quite fill those gaps? What else might we think about doing in that to fill those gaps?
Well, we're working on the assumption that this is a leadership team, right? We're talking about top teams in this one, and we're working on the assumption that we do need all 9 roles. And usually, it is the case that you are going to need all 5 roles because you get 9 roles because you're dealing with fairly complex challenges. They're all different. It could be that the purpose of your team is different. You might be a team that doesn't need lots of new ideas and lots of external focus at the beginning. So let's just sort of acknowledge that there are certain teams that don't need all of them all the time. But if we're a leadership team or a board of directors, the chances are you are going to need all of these 9 roles.
Or perhaps to put that another way, there might be a weighting that you would apply to these roles that just allow you a little bit of wiggle room, that they don't
Hmm.
all need to be there in abundance.
Yes.
But one thought I was having there as you were talking is the idea of inviting others into the
Yeah.
room.
Yeah.
And I don't think this is done enough in business from what I've seen of it and my own experience of it. I've been in 1 or 2 teams where we did that very, very well, and the value of it was enormous, whereby they're not an official member of the leadership team,
Uh-huh.
but for the purposes of a particular exercise, a particular topic, a particular complex issue, as the team, agree to invite certain other people into the room to contribute in whatever way, whether it's to form a project group that has a mixture of people at different levels, whether it's simply by way of inputting certain aspects. I suppose posing that question, does the work that we have to do here always need to be done by these people in this room exclusively? Or is there an opportunity for us to include others to plug some of those gaps? What are your thoughts on that, Fee?
Well, I think that's a really nice way of putting it. I've been in a team where we did bring somebody in who was, I guess, in Belbin terms, they were an implementer, complete finisher kind of role, because we were very heavily indexed on plant and resource investigators. And
Mm,
we just didn't have someone who would go, okay, this is what we are actually going to do now as we leave the room.
mm,
And so we invited the office manager in. She wasn't on the leadership team, but she was flipping good implementer, completer, finisher. She kept
yeah,
us back. She was really super organized, brilliant at holding people accountable, and a hugely valuable member of those conversations. The other classic way that we bring in somebody with a different set of skills is a facilitator or some kind of moderator. Lots of times leadership teams bring in facilitators because they recognize
Yeah.
a behavioral trait that somebody either doesn't have or they don't want to use because they want to be in the meat of the conversation. So, a facilitator will bring in the skill, the behavior of going, okay, what is it we're talking about? How are we going to have the conversation? How long are we going to spend on this topic? What are our rules of engagement? What do we do if somebody wanders off topic? They can bring us back. That's a set of behaviors. I remember talking to somebody, in fact, it was somebody you and I were talking to recently, Jem. They were talking about how they had sort of learnt their value in a team, which was around, am I allowed to question this? Am I allowed to ask for clarity on this? Am I allowed to kind of bring a bit of sober judgment or ask what our success criterias are on this? Is that, is that allowed on this leadership team? And the answer is, not only is it allowed or should it be allowed, it's also needed. Because if you don't have somebody on that team saying, hold on, what are we measuring these ideas by? What makes a good idea good?
Mm.
Then you just have a, well, I think over here, and well, no, but I disagree, I think over there. And if you don't have someone to kind of say, okay, well, what are the success criteria for this idea? How are we going to know which of these ideas is good? What does the data tell us? What's our need? How do we bring us back to what are we actually trying to achieve? Like a kind of moderator, you bring those skills in with a facilitator sometimes. So that's a really
Mm.
nice idea of bringing in somebody that we actually do quite a lot in teams anyway.
It is, and we know, don't we, that facilitators enable everybody who is on that team to fully participate, because whilst ever you are in the role of facilitating, and sometimes it's facilitated by the most senior person in the room, sometimes it's facilitated by the people or HR lead because that's a natural skill set for that person in that room. Sometimes it's facilitated by somebody else. But whilst ever you are in facilitator mode, it is very hard for you to also meaningfully and fully contribute as a
Yeah.
participant. And so
Yeah.
there does need to be some awareness and acknowledgement of that, and when an investment in facilitation is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Just to draw these ideas together as we close this episode, I suppose going back to that idea of those three hats, which, as we said, is the functional expert, the enterprise or organizational leader, so working in the interests of the wider business area or organization, depending on the context of the leadership team, and this behavioral aspect as well, this third hat. It strikes me that we need to remember that it isn't as easy as wearing one hat at a time. We
No.
are actually one of those comical images of
Yeah.
multiple hats on at the same time,
Yeah.
because this is part and parcel of the full role. You can't just choose which of those you are being in a particular isolation of the other two.
Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it. I suppose our behavioral role, we kind of are wearing all the time. You're wearing that hat all the time, although you may be absolutely unaware of it and you may be unaware of what everyone else's behavioral hats looks like. But it's a really interesting point because I think if you could consciously tap into, am I coming at this, am I coming at this conversation as head of ops or head of marketing or head of finance or whatever it might be? Am I coming at this conversation as a business leader representing the whole business? Am I coming at this with an awareness of my strengths and what I bring to this conversation and therefore making space for everybody else's as well?
Mm.
It's just about being aware, which hats should I have on now? Which hats have I got on? And are they the right ones? How much time should I spend with any hat on? What kind of hat conversation is this? And in a way that funny use of language is why I often think that some kind of tool, some kind of profiling tool within a team can be really useful because it gives you a shared language. It gives you a way of expressing something that's shared and is not personal. Because if I said, I'm cringing now, it's possible that I did on occasion say this to Dave, will you stop shitting all over my ideas, is not an entirely professional way of going about things. But I'm sure
Mm,
we've all thought something like that, even if we haven't said it. But if he'd been able to say to me, we've got a lot of plant energy in the room, maybe if somebody had said, we've got a lot of plant energy, we need plant energy, but we don't need too much of it. Let's have a bit of we need a bit of monitor evaluator here to work out which
mm,
those ideas are actually any good or not. Then we all understand what that is. And
mm.
even I, churning out the ideas and going, yes, you're right. I recognize we need a monitor evaluator. And then there's space for all the other roles to fit in. So if you've got a shared language of some description, whatever tool you use, it can depersonalize these slightly conflicting moments that you have. And it gives you, and it's a shortcut for understanding, oh, yes, okay, who's going to be our completer finisher on this project? Oh,
Yeah,
Jem, we haven't got one. Jem, would you mind stepping into it? Or I can speak
excellent.
to that. So it's a shared language, which I think is just as useful as thinking about all those hats in the first place.
Excellent, excellent. Really good to close on that. And I suppose if it isn't already abundantly clear from listening to previous episodes, working that through in your own mind and then ideally also with each other in a more intentional way is being strategic. That is a strategic muscle that you're flexing there just by thinking about these things in a mindful way to actually do something with it.
Absolutely. It's zooming out to look at how do we work, because that affects everything that will cross your desks. Oh, what a good one. I've enjoyed that conversation so much, Jem. Thank you very much.
Me too. And I'm looking forward to the conversations that we're going to be having through this series with other leaders who belong on various teams, because I'm sure we'll get loads of different perspectives in there. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you on our next episode of The Strategic Leader. Bye.
Goodbye. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Strategic Leader. We'd love it if you could subscribe or maybe share with a colleague or just leave us a quick review.
And if you have a big, hairy question you'd like us to explore, or perhaps a strategic dilemma you're wrestling with, just drop us a line. gemma@gemmabullivant.co.uk.
And remember, having a strategic viewpoint doesn't necessarily mean having all the answers. It's more about asking better questions, broadening your view, and staying curious.
We'll see you next time.